Welcome back to the Deep Dive, your ultimate shortcut to being well-informed. Today, we're jumping into marine conservation, specifically looking at a really complex and ancient relationship that's, well, frankly turned tragic. We're talking about seabirds and the global fishing industry.
And our guide for this is a really foundational 2018 review article. It's called A Toolkit to Study Seabird Fishery Interactions, led by Tanguy Labat and colleagues. It's such an important paper because, this interaction, it often gets oversimplified, but it's deeply, deeply nuanced.
That nuance goes way back, doesn't it? I mean, historically, this wasn't always a conflict. Sometimes it was actually mutually beneficial.
Exactly. For literally millennia, seabirds acted as, well, natural cues for fishermen. They'd signal where the big fish schools were, and in return, the birds got something too: food subsidies, basically fishery waste, things like discards, offal, even fish that escaped the nets. Free food, essentially.
But today, that history feels completely overshadowed, right, by conflict. When you look at global fisheries, you see these huge recurring problems like increased competition for the same fish stocks, reduced fishing efficiency because birds get in the way, and the really devastating one, massive seabird mortality, what we call bycatch.
Right. And the authors recognize that understanding these dynamics, it's not just, good science for science's sake. It's fundamental for conservation to actually work. For easing those, let's be honest, often difficult discussions between stakeholders, fishermen, scientists, regulators, and ultimately for getting everyone towards a common vision for managing the whole marine ecosystem. So that was the mission of their paper: review hundreds, 510 scientific publications, and synthesize this entire cutting-edge toolkit we have now for studying this really messy situation.
Okay, let's unpack that, starting with the scale of the threat, because this isn't just a minor issue somewhere. It's a global conservation crisis, isn't it? What kind of numbers are we actually talking about?
The figures are truly alarming. The estimate for global seabird bycatch, just in longline fisheries, is conservatively put at least 160,000 birds every year. And if you look at certain sensitive areas, the impact is just overwhelming. Like albatrosses can make up to 80% of the birds caught in some longline zones.
Wow. And that's just one type of fishing gear, long lines.
Exactly. Factor in gillnet fisheries, those, walls of fine mesh hanging in the water, and the estimate jumps dramatically. Over 400,000 seabirds caught worldwide each year. And that's not even counting other things like collisions with trawl cables, boat strikes. It's just fisheries represent a colossal global threat to seabirds.
But despite this huge negative impact, you mentioned this dual nature. It's important context that for some species, maybe these fishing boats are actually a bit of a boost, at least temporarily.
That's the core paradox, That reliable, predictable supply of food waste, the anthropogenic subsidies, it can actually fuel seabird population growth. Especially for generalist predators, think like gulls or some petrels, birds that can easily switch their diet and take advantage of those easy scraps.
Okay, but here's where it gets nasty. The ecological trap idea.
Precisely. If that fishery waste is junk food, basically low in nutritional value, birds spend a ton of energy eating it but get little back. Their populations might boom at first because food seems abundant, but then their breeding success tanks, leading to a delayed collapse. And even if the food is good, just getting close to the boats to scavenge puts them right in the danger zone for bycatch. Long lines, nets, trawl cables. It becomes an immediate population sink.
The paper points out that despite how urgent this is, conservation efforts hit this implementation gap. We know the problem, but getting unified solutions is tough because, well, different stakeholders have different interests. The author suggests maybe using charismatic seabirds like albatrosses as ambassadors to get people working together. But you can't manage what you don't measure, right? So we need to know exactly where and when these interactions are happening.
Which brings us neatly into the first big category in their methodological toolkit: distribution overlap analyses. The goal here is basically surveillance, identifying the big areas, the large scales, where birds and boats are likely to run into each other.
Right, and this is where the tracking technology gets really interesting, even surprising. So for tracking the birds themselves, PTT's platform terminal transmitters are apparently the most common.
Yeah, about 43% of the studies use them. They give you maybe 10, 12 locations a day. Accuracy is okay, down to a few kilometers, good for long-term general movements.
But if you need pinpoint accuracy,
then you go for GPS loggers. They're heavier, sure, so usually for larger birds. But the accuracy is incredible, like 3 to 5 meters, and they can sample way more often, sometimes down to every second. You get this really detailed picture of their flight path, their foraging behavior, though you usually need to retrieve the logger or have it download remotely.
And then there are these tiny ones, GLS's, global location sensors, like less than a gram.
Incredible, aren't they? They often fit on a bird's leg ring. You can put them on really small species that couldn't carry anything heavier, and they can record for years.
But there's a catch with accuracy, I assume.
Oh yeah, big one. They work by tracking ambient light levels to estimate location. So the accuracy is much lower, maybe plus or minus 190 kilometers. It's a huge trade-off. But researchers accept that loss of precision because they get years of data on migration patterns for birds that are otherwise almost impossible to track over long distances.
Okay, so that's the birds. What about tracking the fishing vessels? Logbooks aren't always reliable, are they?
No, they often underestimate effort or misreport things. So researchers lean heavily on mandated electronic systems now. There's VMS, the vessel monitoring system. It's required for many regulated fishing vessels, tracks their position every half hour to maybe 3 hours, gives a good picture of where the legal fishing is happening.
And AIs, the automatic identification system. That's the collision avoidance thing, right?
Exactly. Mandated for larger vessels to prevent collisions. But it turns out to be incredibly useful for conservation, too, even though that wasn't the point. AIS broadcasts more data speed, direction much more frequently, so it helps map fishing patterns in near real time with really high fidelity, though smaller unregulated boots often don't have it.
Now, the really cool bit the paper mentions is combining these, putting devices on birds that have GPS and a ship radar or AIS detector.
Yes. The Sentinels concept. This lets the seabirds themselves become, well, sentinels of fishing activity. They fly huge distances, right? So they log every time they pick up a vessel signal. They become this amazing remote surveillance tool. They can potentially identify fishing hotspots, maybe even illegal fishing in remote ocean areas where patrol ships just can't be everywhere.
So you get all this tracking data, you map where the birds are, where the boats are, and you look for overlap, utilization distributions or UDs. But the paper makes a crucial point. Just because they overlap on a map doesn't mean they actually interacted, right? They might just be after the same fish.
Exactly. Simple overlap is passive. It just tells you where the potential for interaction is high. We need tools that tell us if the birds are actively, targeting the boats, which means going from the big map view down to individual behavior. And that leads us straight into the second toolkit category, movement and behavioral patterns.
Okay, so now the focus shifts, characterizing the type of interaction. Finer scale, individual birds. The traditional way is fisheries observers, right? People actually on the fishing boats, recording bycatch, watching the birds. Still vital, used in almost half the studies apparently.
Absolutely vital for ground truthing what's happening. But yeah, their coverage is limited. You can't have an observer on every boat. And critically, they often miss birds that are killed or injured but aren't actually hauled aboard. If a bird drops off a longline hook underwater or gets hit by a trawl cable and sinks, the observer might never see it. The mortality event goes unrecorded.
So technology steps in again,
Right.
like bird-borne cameras.
Right. Video monitoring is becoming more common. Tiny cameras on the birds give you their exact viewpoint. You can see them approaching vessels, see direct interactions. It's powerful. The big limitation, as you might guess, is battery life. You only get a short window of recording time, usually.
Okay, but if bycatch is relatively rare, statistically speaking, how do you estimate the total impact from limited observations, whether it's an observer or a camera with a short battery life? Don't you risk massively underestimating?
That's a huge challenge, and it's why simple counting or just scaling up observed rates can be really inaccurate, potentially leading to huge errors. So this is where advanced statistics become essential.
Like the Bayesian frameworks mentioned.
Exactly. These are sophisticated statistical methods designed specifically to handle rare events. Bayesian models let researchers incorporate uncertainty properly and generate much more robust, statistically defensible estimates of total mortality compared to just simple multiplication.
And what about identifying where the bycaught birds actually came from? The paper mentions something almost like forensic science.
Yeah, molecular markers, essentially DNA analysis. Researchers can take a tissue sample, like blood or a feather base, from a bycaught bird. They analyze its mitochondrial DNA to figure out its specific population or colony of origin. This is crucial because it tells managers exactly which breeding populations are being hit hardest, allowing for much more targeted conservation efforts.
And going back to the tracking data, how do they use that to prove an interaction, not just proximity? How do you know a bird isn't just flying past?
They look for specific changes in behavior linked to the vessel's presence. So the analysis checks the GPS tracks for telltale signs. Like, did the bird suddenly change direction and fly towards a boat? Or did it adopt the vessel's slow, steady cruising speed and pattern? Things like that. That confirms the bird isn't just randomly nearby, it's actively switched from natural foraging to vessel following. It confirms an active interaction is happening.
Okay, so we've covered where they are, how they behave near boats. Now, what about the consequences of eating those fishery discards? That's category 3. Feeding ecology independence on subsidies. How much do these birds actually rely on the scraps?
Well, the traditional methods involve direct diet sampling, stomach flushing, which sounds unpleasant, or collecting regurgitations or analyzing pellets the birds cough up, used in about 22% of studies. Researchers look for evidence of fishery prey, for instance, finding remains of deep-sea fish, demersal fish, in the diet of a bird that normally feeds way out in the open ocean, a pelagic species. That's a strong clue.
But those methods are biased, aren't they? You only find the hard bits that don't digest easily.
That's the main drawback, yeah. You tend to find the otoliths, fish ear bones, or squid beaks. The softer, easily digested stuff might be completely missed, which is why biochemical methods have become so important. They give you an integrated picture of diet over time, not just the last meal.
Like stable isotope analyses, SIA. Tell us more about that. It sounds like using the bird's own body chemistry as a record.
It basically is. SIA measures the ratios of stable, non-radioactive isotopes, usually nitrogen, D15N, and carbon, D13C, in the bird's tissues. Think of it simply. The nitrogen ratio, D15N, tells you the bird's trophic level, basically, where it sits on the food chain, eating tiny plankton versus big fish. And the carbon ratio, D13C, is linked to the habitat. Was it feeding near the coast or far offshore? Did it eat stuff derived from the seabed or the open water?
And analyzing different tissues gives you a timeline.
Absolutely. It's like a biological clock. Inert tissues, like feathers, reflect the diet during the period that specific feather was grown, which could have been months ago, maybe back at the breeding colony. But if you analyze something metabolically active, like blood plasma, that reflects the diet over just the last few days or weeks. So by comparing different tissues, you can see how the bird's diet changes maybe seasonally or between breeding and non-breeding periods.
And they use sophisticated modeling here too, not just looking at raw isotope values.
Correct. They often use models like SIAR stable isotope analysis in R, which, again, often involves Bayesian statistics. These models help reconstruct the proportions of different prey sources in the overall diet, accounting for variation and reducing the bias from just looking at one sample type or one point in time. Plus, a big advantage is cost effectiveness. You can often collect tissue samples like blood or feathers relatively easily at the breeding colony, which avoids super expensive ship time for at-sea sampling. Fatty acid signatures are also used sometimes, though less often than isotopes.
Okay, so all this detailed work tracking, behavior, diet forensics, it has to lead somewhere practical. Policy management. That brings us to the final toolkit category, population impacts and sustainability.
Yeah, this is the bottom line, really. Using all that previous data to figure out the actual long-term impact on the seabird populations. And critically, determining sustainability thresholds. Can the population handle this pressure? The simplest way is just correlative. You graph the long-term population trend of the birds and overlay it with, say, fishing effort in their area. See if the lines track together. But that's quite qualitative.
So what gives managers those hard numbers, the metrics they can actually use?
That's where conservation reference points come in. Specifically, something called PBR, which stands for potential biological removal. PBR is a calculated metric. It estimates the maximum number of additional deaths from human causes like bycatch that a specific population can sustain each year without declining long term. It gives regulators an actual number, a hard limit, a red line for mortality that shouldn't be crossed if you want to maintain that population.
That sounds incredibly powerful for management. But I imagine calculating PBR requires pretty detailed information about the population itself.
It really does. You need good estimates of the total population size and, crucially, its maximum potential growth rate or recruitment rate. That kind of data isn't easy to get. It often comes from complex, long-term demographic studies, especially using capture mark recapture data banding birds and tracking them over many years, Over half of the studies reviewed use this kind of data.
And those feed into advanced population models.
Yes, things like age-structured matrix models. These models incorporate age-specific survival rates, breeding success, etc. They allow researchers to estimate those key demographic parameters, but also to test different scenarios. Like, what happens if bycatch mortality increases by 10%? What if climate change reduces food availability and there's bycatch? These models help detect unsustainable levels of exploitation and assess the risk of creating those ecological traps we talked about, hopefully before it's too late.
So stepping back and looking at the Labat paper as a whole, it paints this picture of an incredibly diverse and sophisticated toolkit. I mean, from birds acting as sentinels, detecting potentially illegal fishing, to using biochemistry to track diet shifts, all feeding into models that predict population tipping points.
Absolutely. The big takeaway is just how complex studying these interactions is. You've got multiple species of birds, multiple types of fisheries, birds changing their behavior, everything varying hugely across space and time. And the authors really stress this. Future research has to integrate these different approaches. You can't just rely on tracking or just diet studies. You need to combine them to get the full picture and figure out what best practices actually look like on the water.
And this kind of integrated science is crucial for what people are calling ecosystem-based fisheries management, right? And for ecologically sound marine spatial planning, moving beyond just managing fish stocks in isolation.
Exactly. It's about managing the whole system, interactions and all.
Which leads to the real crunch point, maybe. We have this amazing toolkit now. PBR can calculate the mortality threshold. Birds themselves can potentially detect illegal boats. The science seems increasingly capable of defining the problem and potential solutions.
Yeah, the knowledge base is growing incredibly fast.
So the challenge really shifts, doesn't it? From knowing the problem to actually enforcing integrated solutions across different countries, different fishing fleets, powerful economic interests. Given all that, what stands out to you as the single biggest hurdle in moving from this comprehensive scientific toolkit to effective real-world conservation action on the high seas? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.